In the previous part one of A Portrait of Me as a Young Man, I covered my entry into the Army to coming to Linz, Austria. Part two will cover my travels, further travels in Europe at that time, until I go back to the United States. This looks like the railroad station where I used to depart for my trips around Austria and southern Germany. I remember one time I couldn't wait for the passenger train, so I hopped on an empty car in a freight train bound for Salzburg. I sat down in an open door watching the scenery whiz by for a while, then walked across the top of the train to the cab of the steam engine and engaged the fireman and engineer in sign language for a while. At that time, a uniformed American soldier could do pretty much what he wanted to. It was a different world. I'm posing here in front of a mirror in a Salzburg hotel. I thought I was creating a whole new genre of photography. This is a postcard I wrote to my mother. I remember I was a little PO'd because my brother didn't write to me. More shots of St. Florian, Vienna, Garmisch, Königssee, and Wolfgangsee. Working in a military government office was different than the restrictive environment of a regular Army unit. While other GIs would have to request permission for a weekend pass, I just wrote my own. It also had its drawbacks because a thing the Army called a table of organization restricted the number of officers and non-coms in a unit. And in our unit was all captains, lieutenants, and sergeants, which was way overloaded. So I was a PFC when I went in, and I was a PFC when I left. At least that's the way it was explained to me. Maybe I just did a rotten job and didn't deserve a promotion. But I doubt it, as they could have transferred me out any time they wanted to. This may be an appropriate time to give you a published explanation of the DP situation in Austria in 1947. As early as 1943, Allied forces began drafting plans to meet the challenge of liberating, rehabilitating, and repatriating the millions of displaced persons, DPs, who would come under Allied control. Expecting that the DPs would want to return quickly to their native lands, the American, British, Soviet, and French Allies designated their armies, each of which occupied a sector of Germany and Austria, as the immediate providers of relief to the refugees. The colossal relief effort was expected to take no longer than 6 months. Between May and December 1945, the military, along with the civilian rescue teams of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, successfully repatriated more than 6 million DPs, but the Army was ill prepared to handle the 1 million DPs, mostly from Eastern Europe and including 50,000 Jews, who refused to return to the lands where their families had been massacred and where anti-Semitism still ran rampant. By mid-1947, the number of Jewish DPs in Germany, Austria, and Italy had reached 250,000. This number included 150,000 Polish Jewish survivors repatriated from the Soviet Union who fled Eastern Europe after the pogrom in Poland on July 4th, 1946. This pogrom claimed 42 Jewish lives. With the passage of the 1948 and 1950 DP Acts and the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, the Jewish DPs left Europe en masse, settled permanently in Israel and the United States. The Central Committee dissolved in 1951, and by 1952, all but one DP camp had closed. I tried desperately to remain celibate, but at last it was not to be. A few days after we arrived in Linz, the Staff Sergeant Classic that Woody mentioned before introduced me to this charming woman who opened up new avenues in my appreciation of womanhood. The woman I remembered most fondly was an Austrian woman named Trudy, who ran the photography lab on the top floor of the Red Cross Club in Linz. She lived across the river in the Russian zone that GIs were not permitted to enter. So our contact was mostly at the photo lab, or the occasional picnics in the woods outside of Linz. She greatly awakened my interest in photography. This is the billet I shared with Mike Kramer in Linz. Mike asked me to join him on a trip to Prague at Christmas, but I declined because I already had plans to spend Christmas with Joachim Stockel, everybody called him Jack, and his family, and my secretary Lottie. Jack and Lottie were Austrians who worked in my DP office. At this point, I'd like to tell you about some of the people I worked with in the office on Tollenstrasse. With great regret, I have no photos of them, so while I narrate my story of them, I'll show you some photos of our trip to Austria in 1985. I met my nephew Greg in Vienna. Then we traveled to Hungary and Romania by car, where we had to give up and finally went back to Vienna after meeting impossible barriers to travel by the agents of the Romanian Ceausescu regime. Greg went home and Lois joined me in Vienna, where we spent a delightful 2 weeks roaming around Austria. Back to my story of the Linz Christmas of 1947. Jack Stuckel and I went out to a farmer he knew and bought a goose and fixins for Christmas dinner. On Christmas Day at the Stuckel home, his wife, who had prepared the meal, his very young daughter, his young son Peter, Jack, and Lottie from our office, and I sat down to what was in those austere times a lavish feast. After an afternoon of fun and schnapps trinken, night fell and I walked Lottie home. Lottie was an Austrian lass with a heart of gold and a persona that reminds me a lot of Maria Schell, a popular Austrian movie star. I don't remember if I kissed Lottie goodnight, but I should have. In the early 50s, Captain Robert Wright, the head of our DP office, sponsored Jack and his family to emigrate to the U.S. Jack had a chicken farm in Long Island where Lois and I visited them in the middle 50s. At that time, Jack told me that Lottie had married a lawyer. I hope her life was as happy as it should have been. Recently, I tried to find some trace of the Stuckel family in the U.S., but to no avail. These are some names and addresses I typed up and carried in my wallet. It would be interesting if someone would recognize one of the names now. One day these guys from the Army CIC or CID, some spook outfit, came into town. They got me tipsy and tried to pump information out of me about an episode where I conducted a Russian officer around the rural areas of the American zone of Linz in order that he may try to convince Russian DPs to return to Russia. I don't think he had much success. The spooks gave me this collection of Heinrich Hoffmann's propaganda photos of the 20s and 30s. Hoffmann was Hitler's personal photographer. This is the building on Solomstrasse that housed the military government offices of the DP section as well as the offices of the AJDC, which is the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. Here is a registration card that was filled out by all new DPs in the Linz area. At Christmas time, a Christmas party for the military personnel in our office was held at Hersching, which is just outside Linz, and was the main army base in the area. It was located in what was the Hermann Göring Werks, a weapons factory for heavy equipment. All good things must come to an end, and so in March of 1948, I was back in Bremerhaven, ready to be shipped back to the United States. I was quite taken aback at the proceedings at my departure. I knew that my reputation as chief statistician of Jewish DPs in Upper Austria created quite a bit of excitement. But I had no idea that they were giving me this elaborate send-off. Then someone told me that General Lucius Clay had embarked. We arrived in New York in about 7 days. I was seasick all the way and had not moved my bowels once. To say that I was thrilled and delighted to be on solid ground again would have been the understatement of the year. In the week I was in Camp Kilmerdu being discharged, they tried like hell to get me to join the reserves. I would have none of it. If I had, in a few years I would have been fighting in Korea. Perhaps I would not have been here to tell this tale.